Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Question number one, how did New Testament writers know details about Jesus' private moments, for example, the agony in the garden?
Sure. So they don't answer that question, right? So we're left to our own speculation. And I think we can conclude a couple of things. First of all, they, of course, had intimate knowledge of Jesus. I mean, the apostles walked with Christ both before and after his passion and resurrection. And St. John tells us in his gospel that Jesus said and did many things that are not recorded in the gospel. And remember when Christ gives his command to the apostles in Matthew 28, go into all nations, make disciples, and teach them everything I've commanded you. He didn't tell them to go out and discourse on the contents of a book, but to share their reminiscences about his personal life and teaching and example. So that's the way the faith was transmitted. Not in writing. The Gospels are, decades after Christ. Now, so they have to bring that perspective to bear. It's also true that the Gospel writers are human authors making use of literary styles to accomplish a theological purpose, and so they craft the material for their own agenda. And that's a legitimate thing to do. There's no reason they can't do that. That's a fine thing to do. And it leads to some interesting differences between the text of the Synoptic Gospels. When we have stories of Christ that overlap, sometimes the Gospel writers will put their own spin on it to make a point. So some salient examples, St. Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." But St. Luke says, "Blessed are you poor. Blessed are you poor." And so the tone is entirely different. In Matthew's gospel, he's giving out an abstraction. Like, there is a condition called being blessed, being poor in spirit, and that's a blessed way to be. And he's up on top of the mountain. Christ ascends to the top of the mountain. He calls the disciples to him. He sits there and he opens his mouth and teaches them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Now, the scenery evokes, of course, Moses' ascent on Mount Horeb, on the mountain of God, to receive the Ten Commandments. And so we're meant to have an idea in our head of Christ as the second Moses. Christ as a lawgiver. This is the giving of the new law. But in Luke's gospel, we're told that Christ explicitly comes down off of the mountain onto a plain. Now he's come down to our level. So Matthew is an ascent, Luke is a descent. And rather than speaking in an abstraction, blessed, there's this condition called being poor in spirit, and it's blessed. Jesus is looking at an actual audience. He's looking at individuals, and they're poor. And he says, "Blessed are you poor." So it's obviously the same message, but it's delivered in a completely different tone because Matthew and Luke have different audiences, and they're writing with slightly different theological emphases. Here's another example of a difference that I appreciate. In Matthew's gospel, Matthew chapter 17, the account of the Transfiguration, we learn that Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus and talk to him. That's what he says. Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus and they talk to him after Jesus is transfigured before them. Luke tells us what they were talking about. Luke says Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus and talk to him about the exodus that he is about to perform. And he uses the word exodus, the Greek word exodon. And it's only used twice in the New Testament, once in Luke chapter 9, once in Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews 11, the Greek word exodus refers to the historical exodus. But in Luke chapter 9, it refers to the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so it seems that St. Luke uses the story of Exodus as an allegory for Christ's own passage from death to life. And so there is an added theological nuance in his telling of the very same story, this extra language that conveys a deeper sense of what's going on. The funniest case of redaction criticism, or redaction is when an editor sort of cultivates the material for his own purposes. In Mark and Matthew, we read about, or maybe it's just Matthew, we read about the Syrophoenician woman with an issue of blood. And she, I think it's Matthew who says that she had spent all of her money on doctors and they could do nothing for her. But she sees Christ and says, if I only touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. So she goes and touches, and Jesus feels the power go out for him, and she's healed. All right. Now, Luke tells the same story, but he changes one tiny word in the narrative. He says, no doctor was able to help her. Now, Matthew says she spent all of her money on doctors and they were worthless. Luke was a doctor. So he leaves that part out and says no doctor was able to help her. But the medical profession comes off looking slightly better in Luke's account.
And I think Luke also said a generic English.
Right.
Okay. Recently on Call to Communion, you answered a question regarding reconciling loving your neighbor with Vladimir Putin. Could you restate it again? It was extremely well stated and helped me very much. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So the question on the radio show was, Christ tells us to love our neighbor and to love our enemies. How does that apply to a war criminal like Vladimir Putin? How can I love him? I don't love him. And I find it very helpful to get my definitions straight. And I get my definition on what is charity, what is love from St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas says love is two things. Love is benevolence, that I want the good for someone, and the desire for union. I want to be united with them in that good. So you can have one of those without the other, and it's not love. So if I have benevolence, I can have benevolence towards a person, but not desire to be in union with them. So, let's say I work downtown Birmingham. Guys come up to me on the street all the time and ask me for money. And I can feel pity for them, and I can maybe even give them something out of a desire to do benevolence toward them. I don't want to have them over for dinner, particularly, right? I mean, I'm just an admission, right? So that falls short. That may be mercy, it might be pity, but it would fall short of Thomas's definition of charity. Similarly, you can desire a union for someone and not be benevolent towards them. So let's say Mike and I decide to go rob a bank, and we figure out we'll have a better chance of pulling that off together than alone. So we form a union pledged to the end of knocking over a bank. That's a union, it's a desire for union, but it's not because I will his integral good or he wills mine. In that case, we're using one another because we have our own selfish purposes. So union without benevolence is not love. Benevolence without union is not love. Both of them together, that's what we mean by love. But what is benevolence? Well, it means I will a person's genuine, true, integral good. So if I take someone like Vladimir Putin, what is the good for Vladimir Putin? It is not good for him to conquer the Ukraine. It's not good for him. It is not a good for him to conquer the Ukraine, because this is evidence of a deep, deep wound in his personality and in his soul. Like somebody bullied Vladimir Putin on the playground when he was little, and he is working out. It's very immature. I mean, he seems like a 4-year-old pitching a fit on a playground, right? Why does he want the Ukraine? They have stuff I want. I want your oil. I want your land. I want your dignity. I want. It's infantile. And so to will the good for him is to want for him to develop a moral maturity and to be at peace with himself and to not to need to conquer his neighbors, for his own self-aggrandizement. And it would be loving to want that justice be done upon him, right? Because you remember the good thief on the cross. He said, "I'm getting what my deeds deserve," right? It would actually be good for Vladimir Putin for him to lose his ambitions and to be forced to make reparation, and then to willingly accept that as expiatory, right? So retributive justice, willingly acceptive, can be expiatory. The thief on the cross again says, "I'm getting what my deeds deserve," and Christ says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." So if I love Vladimir Putin, I want him to lose, I want justice to be done upon him, and I want him to reform his life. I mean, I think every one of us here would be deliriously happy if he repented, went to confession, and became an Orthodox monk. And I think under those circumstances, if he came back and said, "I was dead wrong, I'm profoundly sorry, I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing penance," there's not a one of us that would refuse him the gift of charity and friendship. We would, in a heartbeat, we would make sure there aren't any KGB around. We'd have him over for dinner, if he actually had that. So that would be loving for him. And then it would be no trouble to be in union with him in that good, because we would both rejoice in the good of his Christian conversion and the reform of his life. So that's what love for Vladimir Putin means, wanting him to expiate his sins, to repent of them, and to enter into the life of virtue.
I think it's good that Jesus didn't say we have to like our neighbor. We just have to love them, but we don't have to like them or have warm, squishy feelings about them either. But we do have to love them, which is what we
That's right.
talking about. How much impact do you think, or Scripture and tradition say, that the devil? How much impact do you think the devil tempts us on a day-to-day basis? I've given, excuse me, I've grown, and I wouldn't be good with tongues, Joe. As I've grown and stumbled, I feel I can see more instances where I'm being tempted. So
Sure.
how much impact
Sure.
does the devil have?
So at one level, obviously I don't know, all right? And it's not possible for me to know. There is a strong biblical tradition ascribing temptation to malevolent spiritual influences. St. Paul writes in the book of Ephesians, talks about the spirit of the air that is at work in the minds of unbelievers, right? So there's a consistent note in several passages of the Bible that talks about the devil as an agent of temptation in our personality. And, there are theologians who reflect on how this might happen. So St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, believes that the devil can affect our physiology, right? That he's a good physiologist. And, there's certain neurotransmitters you could punch that would activate certain tendency and drives in ways that would be distracting to you in an illicit kind of way. And St. Thomas thinks that happens. Early monastic thinker that I mentioned earlier, Evagrius Ponticus, he kind of took this to an extreme, and he sort of thought that every untoward thought had a malevolent agency behind it, which I think is extreme. But Evagrius does something interesting with that. And so here's what it is. In modern psychology, there's a form of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. Probably somebody in this room is a cognitive behavioral therapist. I'd be willing to bet. Anybody here a licensed counselor, social worker, or psychologist? I'm shocked. There's usually at least one, right? Anybody? But you've probably, don't raise your hand. Somebody in here has been the recipient as a client of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And what is the key insight in cognitive behavioral therapy? You are not your thoughts. You are not your thoughts, right? And what happens to us in our pathologies, in our neuroticism, is that we fuse and identify with maladaptive thought patterns. Like, I'm no good. Nobody loves me. I am a failure. Everything is terrible. It's all bad, right? And what the good cognitive behavioral therapist teaches you to do is to diffuse from those thoughts, to discount them or to dispute them, or to find some way to relativize them and contextualize them so that they don't dominate your personality and you can kind of get on top of them. Well, Evagrius lived long before cognitive behavioral therapy, but because he had the understanding that malevolent, harmful thoughts, that afflictive emotions had an external cause, namely he ascribed them to the devil and to demons, because he believed that, he was able to detach from them. He didn't fuse with them. He didn't identify with them because, he thought they were some malevolent agent trying to mess his life up. And in fact, he writes a book called the Practicus, Evagrius' Practicus, and he gives instructions to the monk on how to confront malevolent, afflictive, and harmful thoughts that he understands as demonic temptations. And he evolved techniques that are not entirely dissimilar to the techniques of cognitive behavioral therapy. And so, you see what I'm saying? So, because he ascribed his negative thoughts to something other than himself, it gave him a sense of mastery over them, and he was able to counter them with other thoughts that were drawn from the gospel. Now, I am not in a position to define for you metaphysically whether Evagrius was right to ascribe those thoughts to demons. I don't think that I can know that, right? What I can tell you is that the Catholic faith has always confronted this in a rational way, right? And has, long before modern psychotherapy, developed tools to acquire equanimity and peace of mind by engaging my thoughts in a detached way, applying, countervailing arguments so that I don't just fuse with them and identify with them, but can gain mastery over them. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit religious order, in his spiritual exercise, has a series of rules for how to confront the experience of desolation. We might say depression, right? And he recognized that people go through emotional states of highs and lows, consolation and desolation. And like Evagrius, he would tend to associate those changes in emotion with malevolent or benevolent spiritual agency. I'm not in a position to evaluate how literally to take those claims. What I can tell you is that spiritual writers for centuries have viewed Ignatius as a guide to healthy psychological living. And in conferences where there are practitioners, in clinical psychology, they learn about Ignatius' rules and they go, that sounds a lot like cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, I'm taking this approach because there is, I think, an unhealthy approach to the question of demonic agency, and that is to find a demon under every bush. And it is possible to become superstitious and fearful about this in a way that rather than affording freedom, can actually involve you in a kind of slavery, right, where you become paranoid about your neighbor or about malevolent influences all around you, and instead of gaining mastery and freedom over them, they can become, you can become quite pathological and neurotic about it. So obviously one of those tends to virtue and equanimity and apatheia and dispassion and self-control, and one of them tends in the other direction. So inasmuch as you think about questions of spiritual warfare or the presence of the demonic or the angelic in your life, remember the rule of St. Thomas that to be in accord with reason is the soul's good. The ultimate end is to regain that beauty and elegance of mind that we lost in Adam, not to live in slavish fear of invisible forces. So, thank you.
Next question. How did you respond to the man who said you were the reason he was not in the Catholic Church?
Well, I didn't tell you the rest of the story. So it was funny. I've actually had that twice, okay? The one that I remember well, there's more to the sentence. He said, you're the reason I'm not Catholic because you don't know the Bible. I know the Bible. I know the Bible very well. And what he meant was, you don't know the Bible as I know it, right? The way you read the Bible is different from the way I read the Bible. And because you don't see the things that I see, therefore, you're offensive to me. And it's been a long time. I wish I could remember everything that I said to him, but I'm sure I said, thank you very much. I appreciate the question. But I do remember engaging him. Oh, I know. I do remember now. I tried to take his critiques of my position seriously and engage them, and he got madder and madder and madder. And the next day, we got a call from a fellow who said, I heard that guy really laying into you and being nasty to you. And after hearing that, I've decided to become a Catholic.
Can you speak to the logic or reason of our faith? I've heard you address this on your show, but I hear so often that decisions, actions based on emotional responses versus logic and reason.
Yeah, sure. Well, we have to distinguish logic and reason are not at all the same thing. Not at all the same thing. So logic really is a tool like mathematics for arranging propositions demonstratively so that conclusion follows from premise. And logic is no guarantee of virtue whatsoever at all. I mean, Vladimir Putin could be very logical about the conquest of the Ukraine if he wanted to be. He's not, but he could be, right? I mean, logic is just a tool, just like mathematics is a tool. It's valuable, but it doesn't really, a logical person doesn't necessarily have the virtue of reasoning well. You have all met conspiracy theorists, right? Some of you may be conspiracy theorists. And if you've met a conspiracy theorist, you know that their beliefs are often very logical, right? Grant me this one premise. Grant me the premise that, that George Bush is the Antichrist, and everything follows from that, right? You start with some beginning point, and I can reason logically to all manner of absurd conclusions that are very counterintuitive and contrary to, to the good of human beings. So logic isn't really the whole show. What do we mean by reason, right? So people confuse reason and logic. Reason, I think, really is our capacity for self-correction, right? That's part of it. Of course, we can reason abstractly. We can use abstractions in language to draw categories and demonstrative conclusions. But ultimately, we say a person is reasonable or irrational, not insofar as they can use language and categorize, but as they have the ability to back off of a dogmatic position and reformulate when they're presented with contrary evidence. So, let's say somebody believes, let's say that George Bush is the Antichrist, okay? And you say, well, what about this, and this? A reasonable person will go, I never thought about that way. I'll have to consider that, and is willing to step back and think twice about their opinion. The person who doubles down, and this is the way most conspiracy theorists operate, who doubles down and goes, oh, no, it has to be, and they refuse to listen to contrary evidence, that's the person that's genuinely irrational. And you've all met people like that in your life. They insist on their point of view, no matter how crazy it seems, and you can't say anything to gainsay them. That's why true reasonableness is a kind of virtue, because it requires a sort of humility. Thomas Aquinas writes about this in the Summa in the article on prudence, right? What is prudence? Well, prudence is the habit, the virtue of good decision making. And now we're really getting into the moral significance of reason. The habit of good decision making. And he says that prudence consists in a number of integral parts. One of them is docility, right? You're not a prudent person if you can't take counsel, right? Because none of us sees the big picture. We all see in part. And we reason better when we reason together. And we subject our opinions to critical scrutiny from people who have expertise in other areas from ourselves in order to gain deeper perspective. If you're unwilling to do that out of, say, pride, well, insofar as you're unwilling to subject your ideas to critical scrutiny, you are being unreasonable, which is why docility and humility are necessary components of prudence or reason. Circumspection, being able to look at things from multiple points of view. All of these things improve our decision-making and the way we approach any kind of concrete situation. So you see, these are not just a matter of intelligence. A person can be very, very intelligent and yet be very irrational. Reason has more to do, it's really a kind of a virtue, this virtue of docility, of active open-mindedness, of the willingness to self-correct. Let me give you an example in theology that I think is quite compelling. You know that medieval theologians invented the idea that maybe the angels did not push the planets around the earth, right? That maybe God imparted impetus to the planets so that they traveled on their own. They didn't use the word inertia, but it was actually medieval Catholic theologians that more or less anticipated the physical doctrine of inertia. And then Galileo, who, like many early modern scientists, did not like to use footnotes and liked to take credit for ideas that were not his own, applied what was in essence a theological doctrine of impetus to some of his experiments and also to Copernicus's cosmology, and articulated a doctrine of inertia. And then, of course, his telescope discovering the mountains on the moon and so forth. And so he began to make a case for a different physical picture of the universe, and that included the Copernican heliocentric cosmology, the sun's at the center of the earth. And that was challenging because from Aristotle on, people had always assumed that the earth was the center of the solar system because it's what it seems to be. We see the sun rise and the sun set. We don't experience the earth turning or rotating or traveling through space, so it seemed counterintuitive. And the best ancient science was geocentric. Aristotle was geocentric. And it accorded with certain passages of Holy Scripture that would seem to suggest that the earth moves in the sun. Like, Joshua during the battle, they stopped the sun for several hours so the Israelites can rout their enemies. So when Galileo proposed that Copernicus was right and that the sun was stationary and the earth went around it, the church was a little bit hesitant. And they said, you can hold this as an academic theory. You can hold it as an academic theory because it does capture the phenomena. Like, your math is good. We recognize that the math is good and it's predictive. What we don't know is it correct as a physical theory of the universe? Like, it as a description, yes, it captures the phenomena. But what is the intrinsic reality? We don't know. And because your view is innovative and somewhat disturbing, we would ask that you not teach it as a physical fact until we can independently verify it, through observation. And that's actually what got Galileo in trouble. It wasn't his doctrines. It was the fact that he refused to put it forth merely as a hypothesis. He put it forward as a physical fact in defiance of church teaching. But when he was called on by the Holy See to give an account of himself, he was with Cardinal Bellarmine, and he told Bellarmine what he thought. Bellarmine wrote a letter about the exchange to a fellow named Foscarini. Bellarmine says this. He says, I think that Galileo is wrong, and I think that his theory contradicts the plain sense of Scripture. But if he can prove it to me by empirical observation, then I will reinterpret the Bible accordingly. I will change my theology to fit the facts. And Pope Urban VIII said the same thing. And at the time that Galileo was writing, we did not have independent empirical confirmation of the Copernican worldview. It was a theory that had not yet been verified. And the evidence that Galileo brought forward, namely that this is the explanation for the tides, was manifestly false, and it failed to convince anybody. So I'm bringing this forward as an example of how rationality in theology can work. Bellarmine's willingness to change his theology, if presented with contrary evidence, is exactly what I mean by rationality. Rationality seeks the best explanation given the data that we have, but is intrinsically open to correction. It's the opposite of mere dogmatism. So I think that's a good example about how theology is informed by rationality, because the church has always said that reason is a norm, and that our reason is a participation in God. And so reason and faith can never conflict. And if they seem to, we've made a mistake someplace, either in our faith or in our science. And we have to keep working at it until we bring them into harmony.
Okay. In heaven, will we know our spouse, or will we be so caught up in the love of God?
Right. So again, we are now talking what eye has not seen and ear has not heard and what has not entered into the heart of man. So you are getting my private theological opinion, which is worth, less than this cup of coffee. But I'll tell you what I think. When Moses and Elijah appear with Christ at the Mount of Transfiguration, they know who he is and he knows who they are. Okay? And all of the hints and intimations and figures of the next life that we get in Scripture presuppose personal identity that's recognizable. I think that Christ came to redeem human life, not to annihilate it, right? And if we have no memory of this life, then it seems to me that this life would not have any spiritual value for us, right? I mean, it would become kind of unintelligible. Why create a world of glory and beauty and virtue and growth and personality if you're just going to wipe the slate clean? That doesn't make sense to me. It makes more sense to me and we get our bodies back. I mean, the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. I mean, it's continuity with my physical body. Why could it be continuity with my physical body and not continuity with my memory? That doesn't make sense to me. So it seems to me that what's likely is the case is that we will have knowledge of our spouses, of our friends, of ourselves, and our past history, but that we will see all those things in the light of glory. And it's like in your life now. You have unpleasant experiences. Sometimes you can look back on them 10 years later and you can see sense in them and you can see value in them you didn't see at the time. I think it'll be that way. I think we'll look back on our lives and say, all of these things I now see in the light of God and divine providence. And so what was painful and difficult at the time now appears to me as beautiful and redeemed. And while there'll be no marrying or giving in marriage in heaven, I have every expectation that I will know my wife as my wife, not in a physical way, but I mean, I will certainly know her as the woman to whom I was married, with whom I had 5 kids. And we will rejoice in that. And that'll call, so I will love all of you in heaven. but I will love all of you differently because you're all different people, right? And I think I'll love my wife in heaven. I'll love her as the woman who was my wife. And that's not how I'm going to love other people, right? There'll be something unique there, but there'll be something unique about all of our relationships. That is my 2 cents worth of humble opinion.
What does my Lord said to my Lord mean? Who is speaking and to whom?
Right, Psalm 110, this is quoted in the New Testament multiple times as a messianic psalm. So there are a number of psalms and a number of passages in the Old Testament that are cited by the New Testament as messianic. They are intimations and typologies of Christ. There is a notion in the Old Testament of a Son of God, right? That is a title used for an Israelite monarch, right? It was typical in the ancient Near Eastern world for monarchs to claim the title Son of God, right? I would have to go back and look at the Hebrew text of Psalm 10, but I'm guessing that in Hebrew it is Yahweh said to my Adonai. I'm guessing that oftentimes the word Lord in the Hebrew Bible is actually an English translation of the word Yahweh, which is the name, the personal name of God. And there's also a word that means Lord in the sense of temporal Lord, temporal master, and that's Adonai. So honestly, I don't have the Hebrew in front of me, but I'm imagining that it's Yahweh said to my king, you are my son. And so this is an enthronement psalm in the context of an ancient Near Eastern enthronement ceremony in which the Israelite king is understood to be God's son. So we can read it as, in a historical critical way as referring to something that is purely contextualized within the life of the ancient Near East. Now, from my last 2 lectures, we never leave it there, right? And Jesus doesn't leave it there. What Christ does in his hermeneutic, his interpretation of the Old Testament, is he takes these passages that have one sense in their context and says, these are also evocative of something greater, right? And there is an ambiguity in the language of Lord, which sometimes can refer to God and sometimes can refer to human temporal power. And Jesus plays with that ambiguity as a way of evoking an awareness that the Messiah will be a divine character, will be a divine person. That's a doctrine that only develops throughout the Old Testament, in particular when you get to a passage like Daniel chapter 7. Daniel has a vision of one like a son of man who goes and stands before the Ancient of Days, and to him is given power and dominion and authority and a kingdom that will never be taken away. It's a grand vision, an apocalyptic vision of a world-conquering kingdom that brings justice and righteousness, something much greater than probably was envisioned in an Israelite enthronement ceremony. And so this is how the Old Testament builds. We start with a rather temporal perspective, and throughout the prophetic books and into the deuterocanonical books, we have this sort of rising crescendo of sort of metaphysical significance, cosmic significance, and the genre of apocalyptic literature sort of comes to a crescendo in Daniel and carries over into the book of Revelation. All of that informs the nascent New Testament messianic Christology, the doctrine of Jesus Christ as the Savior of Israel. So that's how I read it.
I have a Muslim friend at work. He says he views Jesus as a prophet, but not the Son of God, because God cannot have children. How could I respond?
Right. Well, God does not have children in the sense in which he thinks that God does not have children. So he is very much right about that. And when Catholics say that Jesus is the Son of God, we do not mean that he is his biological offspring, right? So Christ is the Son in at least 2 senses. And the most profound, and this is what is captured in the dogma of the Trinity, is the Catholic belief that God has an inner life. That God has an inner life, and that within the inner life of God, there is the reality of relation, right? Now, for most of us, relation is an external thing. I can have a relation with Mike over here as a concrete particular different from myself. But we say of God that there is the reality of relation in his inner life that implies no division of his substance and no confusion and no contradiction. The closest analogy to that we have in human experience is provided by St. Augustine in his book on the Trinity. And he says, imagine the case of an intellect thinking itself. Imagine an intellect thinking itself. So I'm an intellect. I hope to be, aspire to be. I have an intellect. That means I'm a thinking subject. All thinking presumes an object. You can't just think about nothing. You have to think about something. An intellect can think of an intellect. So I could think of my own intellect. Now, if I'm doing that, the subject and the object are somehow substantially the same, because the object being thought is the same thing as the subject doing the thinking. Then there is the activity itself, the act of intellection, which is the activity of the subject thinking itself as an object. And so it is possible for me to understand myself in perfect unity and yet possessing the reality of relation in my inner life, subject, object, and the union between the two. Augustine says that is a pretty good model. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's a pretty good model for understanding something about the nature of the Blessed Trinity. God the Father is called the principle of the Blessed Trinity because from him things proceed. What proceeds is the Son by way of begetting and the Spirit by way of spiration. And so that's why St. John refers to the second person of the Trinity as a Word, the Logos of God, which proceeds from the Father. Because he says the Word Christ proceeds from the Father in a manner analogous to the way the concept or the thought of the intellection emerges from the subject of the person of the intellect. All of these are ways of showing that what we mean by sonship in Christ is something very sublime. It's metaphysically profound, and it is an eternal relation that has no beginning in time, right? But it predicates of God an inner life, the essential nature of which is charity. And so why is the dogma of the Trinity important? Why would we care about the dogma of the Trinity? Why does it matter? Well, you could go through life without knowing it. But by knowing it, you understand that communitarian love is the ultimate reality because it is of the very nature and essence of God. And that fact qualifies our moral lives. Like knowing that God's inner life, the ultimate principle of the universe, is a communion of love, tells us something about how we ought to order our own inner lives. And that's why the dogma matters. Now, that is not what your Muslim friend is rejecting when he says that God does not have a son. And we agree with him in what he is rejecting.
Okay, I'm from Buffalo, New York, so I might need somebody's help in proposing this question. But I think you know where you are, so you will get an idea of what this is about. Will you do the OHIO for us, even though you're from Bama? Yeah, I told you. OHIO. Okay, so could a faithful Buckeye stand up and explain, or maybe the person who said this, come on, somebody, there's a Buckeye here. You're all. Don't be ashamed. Okay, so could you explain it?
As there's four sides to stadium, even though it's a circle. So the short sides you go O, and H, I. So it's like the YMCA, but it's
Okay. So it's O,
okay.
H, I, O. Roll Tide.
That was a short, easy one, okay. I would like to have a better understanding of Vatican II. Any suggestions where to start for someone who needs things in layman's terms? Thank you.
Two resources. One would be the documents of Vatican II. You can't do better, okay? And start with the dogmatic constitution of the Church, Lumen Gentium, which is really the heart and soul of the Council's teaching. So that's good. Another great resource on the Second Vatican Council is, in fact, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. All right? It is promulgated to us as the Catechism of the Second Vatican Council, right? John Paul II promulgated the Catechism precisely because there was a diversity of interpretation about the meaning and significance of the Council, and it led to confusion in catechetics. And so he understood that it was necessary to have an authoritative norm for the teaching and the application of the council to Catholic life. And the product of that is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So this is the authoritative application of the council's teaching to Catholic life and practice. The other resource would be, there's a Jesuit historian named John O'Malley. He's a very competent historian who has a book called, I think, Vatican II, What It Was Really About, something like that. And he has a spin. He definitely has a spin, but his history is pretty good. And, the key to the Second Vatican Council, I think, and of course, the people in the room who lived through the council, and I didn't, maybe no more than I do, but as I understand it, here's the key. So there was a culture in Catholicism from the really from the French Revolution through the 1950s, of a sense of being embattled, of being oppositional, of being in opposition to the modern world and always on the defensive. While this was not unique, this was characteristic of Catholicism throughout the world, it had a particular flavor in the United States because of the immigrant experience of Catholics in the U.S. Catholics came to the U.S. in droves in the late 19th century from Italy, from Ireland, from Lithuania, from Poland, and culturally as well as religiously, they were very much outsiders in the United States, and they typically congregated in immigrant communities, poor immigrant communities in the cities, and their Catholicism alienated them from a Protestant world that was very anti-Catholic, and so they sort of battened down the hatches and just tried to make do and keep the world at bay. And in the United States, that began to change after World War II, because a lot of Catholic kids got the GI Bill, went to college, grew up, became professionals, went off and became doctors and lawyers and dentists and accountants, moved to the suburbs, moved out of their Catholic ghettos, and then John Kennedy showed up on the scene and said, you know what, you can keep your Catholic life private and you can integrate with America and no one has to know you're Catholic and it doesn't have to affect your public policy in any shape, form, or fashion. That's what I'm going to do, watch me, And that's what he did. So he was very popular with Catholics because my Catholicism is my own private thing. In my Americanism, I'm just like the rest of you. So there was a goal of kind of integrating with American life and keeping my Catholic life private. That's one of the reasons that we lost big time in the 40s and 50s and 60s to evangelical Protestantism, because Catholics were all moving to the suburbs. They were moving away from, the urban ghetto and their ethnic communities. And where were the Protestants putting their churches? See, the parishes stayed downtown. The Protestants were putting their churches and their Bible studies and their summer camps precisely in those suburbs, and they were proselytizing and reaching out to those Catholics that had been separated from their historic communities. And so they decimated, Catholic population, and those Protestant churches are filled with ex-Catholics in consequence. So, and within the culture of the church, that sort of embattled defensive posture was maintained. And it was not uncommon for the Holy See to kind of slam down on theologians who were even suspected of doing anything a little innovative or outside the norm. And so there are theologians that today are regarded as quite mainstream and very insightful, who in the 30s and 40s and 50s would have been regarded with a great deal of suspicion. I'll give you an example. There was a Dominican historian and theologian named M.D. Chenu. And Chenu wrote a book on St. Thomas Aquinas that alleged historical development in Thomas's thought, which to me just is manifestly and obviously true, that Thomas changed his mind over the course of his life. But language about historical change and development was thought to be dangerous language. And so Chenu was delated, and he was not allowed to publish, and he was kind of censured for those kinds of opinions. That's sort of the culture of like batten down the hatches and firm up the defenses that made it, for some people, even quite stifling in the culture of the church. And John the 23rd recognized that needs to change, that Catholicism is the light to the nations, that we have something of value to say to the modern world, that the church is not just in conflict with modernity, but that we can be a conversation with modernity, and we can speak to the existential crises of the modern world in a way that's valuable and reasonable. If you've ever read Joseph Ratzinger's book, Introduction to Christianity, this is an ideal exemplar of that attitude. I'm going to take seriously the challenges of the modern world in philosophy and ethics, and I'm going to show you how the resources of tradition can meet that. And I believe that's what the intent was of the Second Vatican Council, to change the posture of the church regarding modernity, not to capitulate to modernity, not to accept all of the theses of modernity, but to recognize that the church was a valuable interlocutor and could be genuinely a light to the nations. We didn't have to hide under a bushel. We could let the light of the church shine before men. And so the council articulated an expansive and beautiful vision of the church and her identity and of her engagement with the modern world. That document is Gaudium et Spes. It's the constitution on the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. That's the text that I read from earlier today when I talked about marriage being caught up into the divine love. That's the sort of shift that Vatican II brought. So I discovered Vatican II as a Protestant. I was not a Catholic when I started reading the documents of Vatican II. And I thought it was wonderful. I wrote an article one time called How Vatican II Made Me a Catholic. Because the stereotype that I had as a Protestant of Catholics was precisely that kind of paranoid, authoritarian, irrational, reactionary approach to everything. That Catholics were these, just kind of reactionary ideologues. And the Second Vatican Council challenged that image. And many of the great theologians that informed the council, guys like Ratzinger and Wojtyla and von Balthasar and Rahner and de Lubac, were for me very seminal in my becoming Catholic. I read their works and I was really just kind of intoxicated by their vision of Catholicity and the beauty and the relevance of the church. And so I think it's a wonderful council.
What is a convincing fact I can share with my Hindu friend that may convince her to become Catholic? She already visits and likes Christian churches.
Yeah, that's impossible for me to answer, right? It's impossible for me to say, here is the one slam dunk fact. Because, look, there are plenty of facts about the Catholic Church that are worth knowing. I mean, I've spent my whole life trying to accumulate them, right? I mean, I know a lot of facts. But the relationship that we have with Christ must be more than a matter of facts. If I said to you, I have a great relationship with my wife because I know all the facts about her, right? It wouldn't be adequate, right? There's knowing that. There's also knowing how and knowing what it's like. We're trying to enter into a transformative relationship with Christ that transforms our personalities, makes us new people in Jesus. And the best way to communicate that is to exemplify to your neighbor the virtue that you think their life lacks because they're not Catholic, right? And if your Hindu friend is more virtuous than you are, then maybe you need to start with the log in your own eye, right? I mean, I have some Hindu friends that are people of extraordinary kindness and virtue. And I'm sometimes ashamed of my lack of the virtues that they exhibit. And so that prompts me, rather than how can I convince them to give up their Hinduism, how can I let my life shine the light of Christ in an exemplary fashion so I can manifest the virtues that I think maybe they lack? And they don't lack many. I have a lot of Indian friends, some Catholic, some Hindu. I have some priest friends that are Catholic. I have a priest friend who is from Andhra Pradesh, one of the Indian states, and he told me that in his state it's illegal to proselytize Hindus. He'll get killed for that. But that Hindus often come to his church and they bring sacrifices of food, fruits, and grains that they lay at the altar. Now, if you know anything about Hinduism, part of Hindu rites is sacrifice is a big part of Hinduism, and the word for sacrifice in Sanskrit is a puja. All right, it's called doing a puja. And I said to Father Jaya, I said, they think they're doing a puja to Jesus, don't they? He says, that's exactly what I think. And I said, they understand the Mass better than a lot of Catholics, right? Because that's what we do. The Mass is a puja, right, of sorts. It is a sacrifice that we offer to God through Christ. Many Catholics don't understand that about the Mass. And the Hindus in his village had a better understanding, because they had a cult of sacrifice in their religion. They had a better understanding of the essential nature of the Mass than many Catholics did. Now, obviously, I think that some of their rites were superstitious, right? And so there's something to be purified there. But I think we proceed principally by charity. Well, if this were called to communion, while Tom was writing, I would be furiously looking up at Thomas Aquinas' commentary right now. And I'd say, well, Chrysostom says. Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to try to anticipate what St. Thomas would say, okay? He would always kind of bring it back to the sacramental life of the church. Well, the sword pierces Mary's heart, of course, at the passion of her son, right? No mother wants to see their child die the death of torture. And her own example of patient, enduring humility and union with the will of God. I mean, her attitude is, be it done to me according to thy word. You know, the Blessed Virgin Mary, we romanticize her, and the artwork about her is oh so precious, right? She had a terrible life. She had a terrible life from a human point of view. Mary got betrothed age 13, 14 to a man that, according to some traditions, was vastly older than she. St. Joseph was much older than Blessed Virgin. She knew they were never going to consummate the marriage. Shortly after they get married, he says, we're moving to Egypt. And so they're exiles in a land where they don't know anyone, they don't speak the language. The authorities are out to kill her. When they come back, they live a life of poverty. Her son begins an itinerant ministry, and everybody thinks that he's crazy, right? And she says it. They think that you're crazy. Their relatives think that you're crazy. And then, of course, she watches him die a death of torture after Joseph had already died. There's no mention of Joseph at the Passion, so he's probably already died. And then she has to go live with her nephew, as a contemplative, and when they watch all of her son's disciples be martyred except John. So it was a very tough life that she lived. And yet she is for us the example of a Christian life well lived, because the disposition of her heart was, be it done to me according to thy word. Now, when we are confronted with examples of virtue and constancy and faithfulness, it elicits from us contrition. I remember when I was a child in high school, I was not a very good guy. My grandfather never criticized me, never lectured me, never told me what to do. He just exhibited goodness to me. He was just a good man towards me. And when I would get around Granddad, I would feel ashamed, because I knew that he did not know what I was up to, and what I was up to was no good. So just being in his presence was kind of wonderful and kind of painful, because his virtue and goodness was such a rebuke to my petty adolescent nonsense. Being around my mom was not like that, right? Mom was a wonderful lady, but she did not mind telling me what to do. And so it was easy to inoculate myself against that, because then I could argue back with her. But you can't argue with kindness. You can't argue with virtue. You can argue with an argument, but you can't argue with goodness. And so the exhibition of his virtue elicited from me a knowledge, right, of what was in my heart. And I really think that's what the saints do for us. I think what the Blessed Virgin does. If you have a struggle with maybe the virtue of purity, you just think about the purity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and it shines in sharp relief your own impurity, and is a kind of silent rebuke. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't have to. She just is. And it's a sort of silent rebuke that can elicit from you contrition and confession and bear the secrets of your hearts.
Okay, I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but it's only an hour show. So after this last question, we'll depart into, and you have to go to pray the chaplet. You can't just leave the room and say, well, I'll play in my car or something. You have to come into the church. And we'll play the chaplet together and disperse from there. Thank you very much for being a part of this.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to meet some of you for the first time and see a lot of familiar faces as well. And for all of our friends from New York, Buffalo area, that are some of the out-of-state people who were mentioned by Father. All right, last question. I am a recent convert. My sister has supported me, but continually reminds me that others have different beliefs that are also right. How would you respond?
I wouldn't respond to that. I see no point in responding to that. What's the point, right? The point of the Catholic faith is that I can be transformed in charity. And so it is of no purpose for me to argue a point that might engender bitterness and animosity and will clearly elicit a retort, it is far better for me to exhibit the virtues of faith, hope, and charity, humility, prudence, temperance, courage. If I am, you can't argue with virtue. I mean, if the faith is not making me better, then it's of no value, right? St. Paul says, if I have a faith that can move mountains, if I have a gift of prophecy, can fathom all mysteries, I give all I possess to the poor. He might also go on to say, if I have apologetical arguments that can slam every opponent, but I have not love, I'm nothing, right? The heart, the soul, the beginning and the end of the Catholic faith is charity, right? I've told this story before. I'll tell it again. Look, I'm not an example, but this one case I think is illustrative. When I became Catholic, I had a cousin who got so mad at me for being Catholic. And I was working at a school. He was actually on the board of the school and had been instrumental in hiring me. And when I poped, he had egg on his face. And he was mad at me and he really upset. And he would not talk to me about Catholicism at all. And we went about 7 years without talking about the Catholic faith. We still hung out. We'd have lunch together. We'd talk about our kids, his church, not my church. I just didn't go there with him. And after a long time, he finally decided that his intransigence was not reasonable and that he would open up and let me talk about the Catholic faith. And so after about 7 years, I said, okay, you're a Protestant. He said, yes. I said, you believe in the doctrine of Scripture alone? He said, yes. I said, okay, how do you know the difference between a dogma and an opinion? He said, what is a dogma? I said, it's what all Christians have to believe. Opinion means things we can disagree on. Based on the doctrine of sola scriptura, how can you tell the difference between a dogma and an opinion? And he went, huh. And then 6 months later, he was Catholic. But I didn't push it for like 7 years. I didn't push it. I just worked on building friendship with him. I have another relative that is very anti-Christian, refuses to step foot in a church. And for most of my life, I was engaged in a kind of low-grade argument with him. And I never made any progress. And several years ago, I made the decision a few years ago, that I was going to shut off that low-grade argument. And I was just going to concentrate on affirming the things that he said that I thought were true. And many of them were criticisms of my church that I agree with. And so I made commonality and goodwill and participation and friendship and humility and not having to be right all the time the foundation of my relationship with him. And I've been able to share more about the Catholic faith from that disposition than I ever had when my agenda was to change his mind. If you are kind and humble and you make people love you and value you, they will want to know what you think. They want to know your advice. They will share with you their broken moments. But if they think that you're there to hit them over the head with a hammer and prove them wrong, they don't want to get within 100 feet of you. So that's what I think.
Well, on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much.
Thank you.